aware of how far you're going to go. And I think we've pushed the boundaries, I think, a lot on sexuality. But I think one has to be very careful when one's dealing with religion. And I think that our media, though we like to think we're very free and fair, I think that literature, festival like this does give an opportunity to explore a lot of things in a kind of length and a discussion, which a lot of social media or sound bites can't do. And sometimes it's a bit dangerous, I think, when you're getting into a very deep conversation, that somebody does take a soundbite and take it out of context or something like that. And that is a worry for me, actually. Especially one day, we did have an in-depth discussion on, comparing religion and other things. And it went off beautifully, because I really felt that this was a time where we have to be relevant to what's going on around us. We need to have this discussion, but I know that people were wary that we were having it.
And then one question which I'd also want to ask, it's there's one thing about culture is the content, what's being written or what's being produced, but more than that, it's also about the way it is organized. So to come out of we've been talking a lot about literature festivals. Could there be other structures in which culture could be propagated and which could perhaps be more effective, could perhaps populate more classes?
Well, doesn't it do that through the internet? I mean, I'm presuming it does, as an older person. I'm presuming it does. I mean, of course, one wants to sort of, we'd love you to go back to the sort of 1930s where they had those sort of study groups for working class men, and when one reads about that or hears about people talk about it, it seems such a wonderful thing, that existed. But at that time, also don't forget, people just read a lot more. People read in a way that people don't read anymore. So I don't know what can be done. I know what you mean, but I don't know what role literature plays in that, because to me, literature is such a, there's a kind of, especially the novel is a private thing. Poetry, I think, can have a more communal effect. And certainly in Sri Lankan Tamil culture, the reading of political poetry in poetic activity.
I just want to ask you here, what exactly do you mean by a private thing? What does it mean to you? What does it denote?
Well, it means that in a world in which there's so much where everything is censored and pressed and all that in terms of the media, in terms of, but I'm talking about the West, where there's so much information and so much stuff coming at you. The act of reading is so important, I think, because you don't just read. You don't passively receive it. You actually have to actively engage your imagination. The way you create in your head how so-and-so looks is not the way that I create the way so-and-so looks. And that act of, there's a kind of a negotiation. I think that the way I feel is that each reader who reads one of my novels, in some sense, participates in recreating the novel. And I think that's a kind of, I don't use the word, I'm trying not to give it more courage than it deserves.
Right.
But you know what I mean?
Okay. I'm sure. And the other thing, with Sadaf, is this idea of noise that Shyam said, that and I can see that this profusion of literary events happening all over. Suddenly, there are mushrooms. Suddenly, in our own city, we have 3 literary festivals. I don't know what good effect it is, but that is still to be seen. But there's also this idea, which even I remember Umberto Eco writing about this, the whole idea of noise, that if you have so much information that it actually obfuscates your view and takes you away from things that you're actually supposed to focus on. What would you have to say to that?
Well, I think that where you have people doing long tribes on Facebook and all of that, I actually think that some of the discussions that we've had at our literary festival, and where I want to keep, I think, that focus, is actually being able to have an intense conversation. Actually wanted to go away and read a novel in depth and have that private time. So I think that is it's kind of bringing one home to that inner peace, or that inner longing to really get into a book. I think that it's kind of trying to bring people back to that, the beauty of the book. And we had children, a whole children's section for this time. So rather than the sort of, like MTV World, have that time and energy to, you can write a book yourself, you have to take the discipline, explore what you want to write about, try and encourage young people to write workshops, that kind of thing. And I just wanted to get back to the previous thing about the different classes and everything like that. And I mentioned at the beginning the sort of grassroots oral traditions and basically supporting that. And I've been involved with that in various levels. Our old martial arts and our different other cultural practices, which come in the form of theatre and music and dance. And then usually we have like 30% of people below the poverty level in Bangladesh. And these cultural practices are actually promoted or performed the most by these marginalized groups. These are the groups that are still questioning and still debating, whereas some of the more formal, the formal structures are kind of much more rigid and not questioning. So I think we have to do something to encourage that. And when we're talking about the other thing is this sort of fundamental Islamicist idea of trying to infiltrate, because culture is very fluid. And so suddenly we'll find ourselves in a total alien situation, which is not the path that we've come on the last few centuries or our whole history. The danger is, I think, when you have, in a very economic sense, where you have two streams of education, and madrasa stream, which, the marginalized are, availing the system, and that's where all the petrol Saudi dollars are going into, which have a very different kind of Islamic culture that we have. And being able to come in through that way is very, very important to, challenge it at all levels and to keep this inquiry. And so then you have it right at the top and right at the bottom. Maybe having a literature festival, but I am trying to find some way, and not just through Hague, but I'm involved in various other social initiatives to try and bridge that gap. Even at a grassroots through tourism, to be able to give some kind of economic benefit for people to maintain some of these practices. Because it is theatre, it is poetry. Our bowel songs are like anthems throughout Bangladesh, and these are egalitarian songs about tolerance and understanding. So it's this connection, literally from each and every level, that I'm trying to sort of connect with in different things I do.
So just taking on from this, this the last question. So do you think that could culture exist in a cocoon outside of social and economic realities of a society? Or do you think any program of moral and intellectual reform in a society has to be very closely interlinked with the social and economic reform?
Well, any good literature is engaged with the society which it's created. All the best literature is. So it doesn't exist in a cocoon in that sense. I don't know how, I'm not going to answer it for the other arts because I'm not going to do that. But it can't, it shouldn't, it mustn't, especially now in a situation like Sri Lanka. And it doesn't in a situation like Sri Lanka. It really doesn't in any of the communities. It is inflected. Everything that people write is inflected by the war and what's happening.
Right, so on that note, I think I have to open it up to the audience. We can take a couple of questions. And is there somebody to pass on the microphone? Someone right at the front, if you could just get it here.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, in the 30 years of conflict, is there really any culture left? Because the LTT, the Tamil Tigers, whoever, They were so busy mobilizing the force to fight off an offensive. I mean, they must have, and the kind of slaughter that took place. So the generation of people who must have nurtured a culture, I don't think it exists anymore, because I visited Sri Lanka as a tourist last July, and I was quite surprised that the language of Tamil, Tamilian, it was not even understood where I went, you know. I mean, has it been blacked out?
Well, you probably went to the south. So
I did go to the south, and what about in Colombia?
Well, you know, Colombo's always been a kind of polyglot. So, you know, you might not have encountered the Tamil section. Let me put it this way. There has been a sort of a mass exodus of the Tamil intelligentsia. The best Tamil poets now live in the diaspora. Most of the Tamil writers live in the diaspora, but their work is read in Sri Lanka. I know what you mean, and I was also very curious to see once the war was over, and it was possible to go into the Tamil areas to see what was there. But you know, it sort of affirmed not even my belief, but it showed me that culture matters to people, and that when that culture is under threat, it really matters to people. And then I realized that I, in some level, as a Colombo person, to take it for granted that my culture isn't under threat. And they had maintained it, and they did know it, and they loved it, and they had developed it under this, you know, in this situation. Those students I had in my program from Jaffna were just stellar. I mean, they just had a kind of incredible sense of themselves and their culture and knowledge of it. And I was amazed by that, actually. I really was amazed. And so yes, it does continue on. I think it's continue. I think what's frightening is what could happen now in the Tamil areas. I think that I wonder if there could be a sort of cultural an attempt. I mean, certainly when you go to Jaffna, any moment they see a board tree, they stick a Buddhist statue under it, is what the government's doing. So there's a sense of Buddhicization of certain cultural sites. It's very interesting. Or rewriting of Buddhist sites in Jaffna along sort of conflict lines, which is very strange. You know, for example, there's a site in Jaffna where it's this Buddhist mount, you know, and when you go there are there's stories that this used to be a Buddhist land, and then the Tamil king kicked the Buddhists out, and you see all those marks on those mounds. Well, that's the OTT. They've shot it with machine guns, but it's all rubbish. There were Tamil Buddhists. I mean, two of the Tamil epics are Buddhist epics. So, you know, rather than trying to bring things together and showing similarities, there's a kind of separation that goes on. So these are the things that are worrying at the moment. But yes, it does continue on.
The unifying thing in northern Sri Lanka and Jaffna is the language.
Yes, of course. Yes.
There are Muslims, there are Christians, there are Hindus, but the language is what holds them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Just one last question.
Hi. I think like a lot of people, I sort of am bilingual in terms of as a reader. So I read in English and I also read in Bengali. The question that I had is, literary festivals are normally seen to be sort of, you have English, I'm not talking about so much the speakers, because that can be taken care of by translators, obviously. But in terms of the audience, there's a sort of I would say a sort of a quite clear bias towards people who are probably more comfortable in English. I'm not saying that there should be a separate festival for vernacular or non-English, but I'm just curious to know that in terms of getting a popular or populist or whatever you call it, a kind of literary festival, should there be a sort of wider, deeper, and I don't mean it sort of judgmentally, I mean it pure in terms of the numbers. Because there are sort of, I mean I can speak for, let's say in Dhaka, more people read Bangla, sort of high literature, and in Kolkata similarly. I'm just wondering what your views are on this sort of, when you talk about a festival and engagement, language does come into play. All your opinions on how that can be tackled,
Well,
if it needs to be at all.
I think it's an important question, and we really tried to tackle it in Bangladesh, because as I started off by saying that was one of the issues we had, and, but not because it was an issue. I just felt that it's in Bangladesh, and Bangla literature is so immense. So we did actually have a small Bangla session in the first year when we had a day-long short festival, and then we grew it to 3 days, and I think over half of the panels are, or at least half of the panels are in Bangla. Recitations, the performance, dramatic reading, and then actually serious panels in Bangla, and amazing panels in English, of course, as well. But I think the idea that it is also to bring in young people so that they can get to hear it in Bangla and engage at a certain level, but they will also be around for the English sessions, so they will also hear and understand. And a lot of the questions we had in the English sessions were from young people who were obviously not as fluent, but their questions were stellar. They obviously understood that they're getting that exposure. And with the Bangla sessions, we have all the great literary people, authors and poets involved in the festival. And the idea would be to actually make it a standard so that, anybody in Bangla is also excited that, oh, I must, even high intellectual, I must go there because I can't miss this conversation. And also popular Bangla. So Dr. Zafar Iqbal, who's, does very popular stuff for the kids, they had an amazing conversation with him in Bangla. The other thing that we had the first year, which we avoided last 2 years, but we want to introduce it again, is a bilingual where we have international and our Bengali greats having a conversation, but it would have to have some translation. So we didn't have it the last 2 years because it would, stop the flow. But we had a beautiful session in the first year where John Gower was a Welsh writer with Selina Hussain, who's our Bengali writer. He actually did not know much about our language struggle or anything, but the way the conversation was, the two bonded so amazingly on the idea of language from his Welsh experience and our Bangla experience, and obviously the sort of colonial influence of English. It was such a touching session that we want to see how we can have more of those.
Well, I'll just answer it briefly. I mean, the popular word in Sinhalese, the colloquial word for English as a language is kadua, which means the sword that divides the haves from the have-nots. So English is because of the way it's sort of national language history in Sri Lanka. It is the language of the elite. So, it's my language. So that's where I start, by an admittance that it is the language of the elite, and that the majority of people who are coming to the festival are the elite. So if I was going to undertake the festival, I thought to myself, I have to accept that this is so, and then try and, I keep coming back to the word queer, but queer it in some way. But the thing that I don't want is tokenism. I don't want to ask the great Sinhalese and Tamil writers to come and sit there and have 3 people turn up because the English elite have gone off to look at Tom Stoppard or Cork at Richard Dawkins or whatever, right? I mean, there's something about it that never quite worked for me, and I never, in my 2 years, solved that issue. And I really, it was an open-ended question because it felt that to me bringing in the other languages in Sri Lanka into the Gaul Literary Festival had a sense of tokenism, and having been a token myself in the West, I'm very much against the idea of tokenism. I know how humiliating it is as a writer, as an artist, to be a token. So I don't have an answer to that part, I have to tell you.
Right.
But the audience still has to attend. And what am I going to do? Drag them in kicking and screaming? That's the problem.
I think just to sum it all up, I think it's been a privilege of our times, especially the specific histories and geographies that we inhabit with its tremendous social and political upheavals. It has cultivated so much ground for art and culture than we could have ever imagined before. But perhaps the real object of cultural struggle doesn't lie to, wage the struggle within the existing cultural structure, but rather to provide alternate ways of cultural organization, so that somebody from the culture finds itself in town squares, under factory sheds, in colleges, wherever, and common people could actually get to it and could find in it their solace, their imagination, their inspirations, and perhaps in that purpose, culture should truly live. So thank you so much for attending this session.
Thank you so much, Sadaf. Thank you, Shyam, and thank you, Pritha. The next session is at the Canopy, which is by the East Gate. So I would kindly request you all to just move there, please. Thank you. It's already started, I think.